Well, thanks for coming tonight. Appreciate it. Good to see everybody here. We continue the lecture series. This is our first fall lecture series, so I want to welcome you to the Historic District and thank everybody for coming. Tonight we have Susanna Brody, celebrated Chester County historian, here with us tonight. She is the author of many books, the Chester County Biography series, Volume 1, 2, and 3. Rebecca Lucas is in the second one, which is called, what is that, Chester County?
Constant Struggles.
Yeah.
She's also on the cover of it.
Yeah, yeah. And so that's a great series, Chester County Biographies of Celebrated People, and Rebecca. And then, of course, the history of Dowling Forge as well is interesting, and read that, and I recommend that. Also does living history presentations. Many of you know her from her, the roles of Rebecca Lucas and many other historians as well. You also do workshops and help people with the living history. Most notably is that you have a Master of Arts in Oral Traditions from Connecticut and from the Graduate Student Institute of Connecticut, and a member of Patchwork Storytelling Guild and a National Storytelling Network. So without further ado, we have Susanna. She's going to talk to us about Chester County stories, remembering Chester County, stories from Valley Forge to Coatesville. So thank you very much, Susanna, for coming tonight.
Thank you, Scott. I'm going to apologize ahead of time. I usually do programs as a storyteller, so I'm not in back of a podium. But I have found with this program on my new book that if I don't stick to my notes, we'll be here all night. I talk too much. So forgive me, at least the beginning of it. I'm going to refer to my notes. I want to share with you the adventure that I had in this last year in getting a new book published. And I'm going to move over here for just a second and pick up the book. This is the new book. It's called Remembering Chester County, Stories from Valley Forge to Coatesville. I have to admit that I am not the one that came up with the title. The publisher, the History Press, which is headquartered in Charleston, South Carolina, this is part of their American Chronicles series, and they have Remembering Charleston, remembering different places, and they decided that that's where my book belonged. And they are also the ones that came up with the stories from Valley Forge to Coatesville. So without any intention on my part, Coatesville got highlighted right on the cover. So that's always nice. I must admit, it's been fun being an author, at least this last year. This is not my first book. I've been involved in researching Chester County history for more than 30 years. I have written some books for the Euclid Township Historical Commission and for the Chester County Historical Society. This book, however, is the first book that I have ever done that was published by a commercial publisher. And there were vast differences in the way this whole thing evolved in the last year. I began storytelling about 20 years ago with the assistance of Coatesville resident, storyteller, and teacher Deborah Peary, who happens to be sitting on the front row tonight. So thank you very much. Deborah is the one that got me into storytelling. And at that time, I was a learning support teacher in an elementary school in Downingtown. And I was looking for a way to help my reading disabled students improve their comfort with reading and their comprehension skills by doing storytelling. And one of the things that I found, particularly the last couple of years before I retired, was a wonderful added bonus that I had not anticipated when I first got into storytelling. And that was that I used to take my students And we would work on storytelling, and we would go around and visit the kindergarten, first and second grades and share the storytelling. And what happened was, instead of my children getting picked on out at recess because they had to go to the special ed room, or, there's many terrible things that they could have been called, we found the kids were saying, "Oh, there's Chad. He was in that storytelling we saw." And it was a wonderful, wonderful thing for their sense of being, their self-image. I never expected that, but that was a bonus. Well, by the time I retired from teaching, I had developed several storytelling programs that combined my interest in local history with the storytelling. And I particularly found, as I researched local history, I would come across either a person or an incident that kind of caught my attention, that I knew I wanted to come back and take a closer look at that. It really might not apply to the broad history I was researching at the time, but just kind of stuck in my head. Well, I also, over the years, developed, in addition to American Revolution, Underground Railroad, different stories on different time periods, I developed first-person portrayals of women in history, particularly Dr. Ann Preston, who was born in West Grove, Chester County, and became one of America's first woman doctors, and was an activist very, very early on women's suffrage. And of course, Iron Master Rebecca Lukens. Anybody that's sitting in here today has to know about Rebecca Lukens, so I don't need to go in further about that. But Rebecca Lukens has kind of taken up residence inside me. And every once in a while, she just kind of comes out and talks to people. Well, looking back now, it's kind of hard to imagine that this project began just a year ago. A representative from the History Press contacted Patchwork, this local storytelling guild to which I belong, looking for people with stories on local history. Now, their reasoning at the time, the History Press is headquarters in Charleston, South Carolina. So if you go online or if you send for their catalog, they have a vast assortment of stories on local history in southeastern United States. And for several years, they also had a branch office in Boston. So they have a whole section of local history books on New England. And they were looking to expand in the Mid-Atlantic region. So the editor was given me the opportunity. I got an email about contacting her, and I did. And I sent some written examples of some of my Chester County stories. I was offered a book deal. I sent in a proposal outlining the stories that I had in mind. Now, some of these stories I had spent years perfecting for my storytelling, and I was quite comfortable with them. Some of the stories that I put in the outline for this book proposal were just ideas in my head. No research, no writing, no developing the story yet. But still, I went ahead and sent in the proposal. Surely, I figured, I could put something together by the end of April in 2010. That would give me 6 months that I could gather the rest of the work that I needed to do. Well, panic kind of started to set in when the contract arrived for me to review. All of these other books were done by either a local municipality or a nonprofit society. I'd never had a written contract for anything. This written contract was a very lengthy legal document. I was expected to write 35,000 words and provide 30 to 40 images, preferably vintage photos. Well, I had never sized anything by word count before, so I needed to visualize what 35,000 words meant. It really didn't sound too bad to me at first. What I did was I combined my stories that I knew were already pretty much ready to go, combined them onto one computer document, and let the computer count the words. I had less than 12,000 words. A third of what I needed to do. Well, another difficulty arose when I contacted the Chester County Historical Society. And this is my own fault. I did this biography series for the Historical Society. And these are, I'll pick up the middle one because this one does have Rebecca Lukens on the cover. But these were specifically designed by the Historical Society in this format, because we gave teachers permission to copy them for classroom use. So, as Deborah, a former teacher, can attest, this is basically a glorified black line master. We slap it on the copy machine and make copies of it and use it in class. And very unusual, it was specifically designed for them. Okay? Well, because I love stories, I had worked some of my little stories into the biographies. So some of you may have heard of Squire Thomas Cheney, who was the one that gave General Washington word about where the bulk of the British Army was at the Battle of Brandywine, when the British were trying to sneak up the west side of the Brandywine and come around and surround the Continental Army. Well, I included that little incident in his full life biography. So I contacted the Chester County Historical Society about using those story sections for my story. These books were published 10 years ago. They are pretty much not available now, except through me. I think Volume 3 can still be had at the Historical Society. They have no intention of reprinting them at any time in the near future, but the lawyer still insisted that they owned the copyright control, not just of the publication, but my words as well. So that was a serious, serious block for me. Eventually, I resolved it by asking the director to grant me specific written permission for specific parts of certain biographies. And I said that I would reword them. And I was granted permission to do 5 specifically, each one considered on an individual basis. And that was okay with their attorney. I hope someday to get the copyright back on my words, but for now, they belong to them. At any rate, the History Press contract specified, they didn't give me any deadlines when I suggested the end of April. They didn't give me any deadlines on when different steps would be done. Well, the photo images would be due March 15th, the rough draft March 30th, and the final draft April 15th. Now, as far as I'm concerned, that's like a whole month earlier than what I was thinking. But then the editor challenged me even further. She sent an addendum to the contract with an incentive to complete the book even sooner, increasing my small royalties. Now, as anybody that knows me well knows, that's hard to resist. It's really hard to resist. I, by the way, haven't received any royalties yet, so I don't even know how much they are. But I just had to complete everything a month earlier. So we're talking February 15th, February 28th. At any rate, despite the growing panic and my husband saying things like, you want to do this for? You're retired. I signed the contract in mid-December. So I pretty much worked full-time on, and you realize I was still researching as well as writing. I worked full-time for 2 months. I also had to find photos. Now, the Library of Congress has thousands and thousands of images that are available, and you can get them online, and most of them are really quite useful. However, some of them have a small print at the end of whatever they're describing saying, some restrictions may apply. Well, if it has that, the History Press wants no parts of it. We're not going through the thing of getting permission. You have to have complete public domain permission for these things. So that made that a little bit of a challenge. And then there were some of my local history stories that there really just isn't any photo or image appropriate. You know, the stories started at the time of the American Revolution and come all the way up to present day. But for a good part of that time, there wasn't any photography, so we didn't have much of anything. What could we do? Well, we could go out and take photos at sites, you know, around the county that might have something to do with it. And this is when a close friend of mine came to my rescue. You know, I'm figuring, how am I going to finish the research, do the writing, and go out and take photos? And my friend said, give me a list. And so my friend Jenny Gallagher volunteered to help, and with my list of potential sites and camera in hand, she traveled through Chester County, recording about 75 images so that I would have a choice of what to choose from, while I stayed home and wrote and wrote and wrote. Well, as the deadline approached, the other problem that I had is this biography series was done by the Historical Society. One of the wonderful advantages of that is that I wrote the biographies. I participated in the design of the books, but the Historical Society provided 90% of the images that are in those books. And they have a photo collection of more than 75,000 images, most of them related to Chester County. So they've got lots to choose from. Now, I naively thought that after all the years that I had volunteered for the Historical Society, and I had done a tremendous amount for them, that, you know, they might cut me a break. Well, for use of one of their images, it is $25 a pop. So it's not a general fee, it's each image you get, it's $25, and they would not give me any kind of a break. So I early on thought, I'm not going to use them at all. Well, in the end, as the deadline approached, I did use 3 of their images. I also, the day that the photos were due, and I had sent everything in the day before, I was able to locate my last image so that every story has some kind of image. Some of them have 2, but most of them have 1 image connected with them. And that last image I got from the Historical Society of Phoenixville. In 1877, the Pickering Railroad had a devastating wreck, and they actually had a vintage photo of that, which they allowed me to use at no charge. Now, the deal I made with them is I'm probably going to do this program for them sometime in the spring, but that's easy to do. Historic Yellow Springs was also very, very helpful, very generous. The archivist was very generous with her time and with supplying me with information. There are actually 3 individual stories in the book that are related to Historic Yellow Springs, and they provided me with 2 photo images also at no charge. Enough said about that. At any rate, I met my deadline. I not only met my deadline, I provided 40 images and 36,000 words. I submitted the draft by the end of February, and that was supposed to be the rough draft. They did not require it to be redone, so my final work on that was done. About 2 weeks later, now, all of this was done by email. Every bit of it, the text, the photo images. My husband helped because the photos had to be in a certain resolution and a certain minimum size, and he took care of all of that for me, but it was all sent online. This is the new world here. Well, the History Press was now responsible for the rest of it, and their estimated time in their contract was 4 to 6 months. And part of the reason that I had originally given a deadline of the end of April was that if it took them 6 months, the best time for books to come out is in the fall, particularly these little local history books, because people buy them for holiday gifts. So you definitely, January's not a good time, but October's great. Well, the History Press way exceeded their things. 2 weeks after I sent in the rough draft, I got an email from a nice young man named Ryan. I say nice young man because when I talked to him on the phone, he sounds like he might be 15. I know he's out of college, but he sounds very young. At any rate, the text had to meet the guidelines set by the Chicago Manual of Style. Now, this is college students, I'm sure, know this now, but there's two premier, and I know we used one for the Graduate Institute that I don't remember the name of it, but it tells you how you're supposed to do papers and stuff and how it's supposed to be worded and grammar and spelling and all of that. And Ryan is a stickler for the Chicago Manual of Style. Even some things were not the way I would have done it. But, I had grammar 50 years ago, so I'm not into what's up on it now. But surprising to me, there were no major demands for change. No stories that they said had to be rewritten or eliminated. I really still had complete control of what I was putting into my collection of stories. Well, in April, I flew to California for a month to help take care of our, at that time, 2-month-old granddaughter. Now, you might ask, what would I have done if I had that April deadline? And my answer is, I have no idea. I don't know. It's just sometimes things turn out the way they're supposed to turn out. So there you are. At any rate, the amazing thing is that I got a call while I was still in California at the end of April from the History Press telling me that the book would be done in the middle of May. It took them 6 weeks from when they got my rough draft to put the entire thing together and have it out. I forgot one other thing. They wanted something special for the cover, and at first I wasn't sure what to do. I had photos that were taken by Jenny at Brandywine Battlefield because there is a property there's a house down at Brandywine Battlefield called the Gilpin House. I believe it was Lafayette's headquarters, not Washington's. That just to me looks like Chester County of long ago. It's a wonderful old stone farmhouse with outbuildings, and it's got rolling hills and trees, and it's just my mental image of Chester County. But it was a photograph. Now, they probably could have used that, but giving her 2 weeks' notice, I asked my sister, whose hobby is watercolor, to paint me something. And she did. She also spends half of her year in Maine and half of her year in South Carolina. So the way we were able to do this on such short notice is she delivered the painting directly to the History Press headquarters in Charleston. I've never been there, but she's been there a few times. And I know it's small to see, but this is her cover that she did, and she did some artistic license because this is the Gilpin House. It doesn't have quite that many rolling hills in the background now because about 100 yards behind the Gilpin House is Route 1. But she knew what I wanted. And the other thing is that both of these outbuildings, these small barns or carriage houses, are near the Gilpin House, but you wouldn't see both of them in the same image. This one would have been over here and a little uphill. So she just kind of took artistic license and moved them all together. And the other thing, when you see this book cover, is that they took what basically was pretty much a square image with the sky on the top, and they separated it. So here's the sky up here, and they put the title in the middle. They really did a very nice job. But this is what they were looking for. You know, a photo would have been fine, but a painting is better. So this is how things all came together for me. Now, by May, when I got back home, I'm getting emails from their marketing company. Now, in the past, these books were marketed or not, but I had really no control about it except telling people, you should take a look at them. And the nonprofits and the municipality really don't do marketing on a grand scale. Well, the History Press is interested in marketing. So by the time I got back from California, they had already set up 5 book signings. So this summer I did book signings. They readily accepted any advice from me. One of the things that I did have to send them early on was what they called a marketing survey, but they wanted to know information. So I gave them all the historic sites in Chester County, you know, any place that might be interested, that kind of thing. But as I thought of other things, someone suggested to me the gift shop at the Chester County Hospital, because she works there as a volunteer, and she said, this book would be great because if you've ever been a patient in a hospital, you know, you often don't have the concentration to really be doing serious reading, but these are short stories, you know, little bits of Chester County, that kind of thing. So I emailed and I said, you know, somebody suggested this to me, do you want me to look into it? And they said, oh no, we'll check it out, we'll send our marketing stuff. So I sent them a list of all the hospitals in the area, and they take over those things. They just have a sense of what they're doing. Recently, I got my storytelling magazine that's put out by the National Storytelling Network, and I noticed they have a book review section. So I sent that information to Dan, my marketing guy, and he emailed back and said, yeah, he'll be glad to send them a complimentary copy of the book. I didn't have to do it. They do it, you know. So take a look. I might be in the National Storytelling Magazine. At any rate, it really comes down to, about this book, that I am a storyteller. I love the fact that the stories that I share kind of bring to life some of the history that can be dry. It tells about the people that lived here, some of them famous, some of them not so famous. So I want to share with you some samples of what I have. I start with several stories that are all in the late 18th century, around the time of the American Revolution. And they include Squire Cheney's Ride, but they also tell about Ned Hector, who was a black teamster in the American Revolution. And at that time, by the way, the Army was not segregated. And he was a free black. He was probably a teamster before he went into the Army, but what the Army did was they pressed his horse and wagon. So he could either give them to the Army, or he could enlist and go with them. And he did. And in fact, at the Battle of Brandywine, when the Continental Army went into retreat, and they went into retreat rather hurriedly, he disobeyed orders because they were told to leave immediately and leave everything in the field, and he refused to leave his horses. So he walked his horses through the battlefield with the wagon, and as he walked through, anytime he saw muskets, any weapons, he picked them up and dumped them into his wagon, and in fact saved quite a bit of the guns that the Continental Army had left behind. So that's the kind of stories that I do. Well, toward the end of the American Revolution, when the fighting was no longer in this area, I've got a couple of interesting stories that I really like. One is, did you know that Chester County had a witch trial in 1780? So I've got the story of Molly Otley and how she was charged with being a witch and how that was resolved. Susanna Longenecker I love because she's got my name. But she belonged to the Church of the Brethren in northern Chester County, and they were like the Quakers, they were pacifists. And toward the end of the war, in 1782, she was charged and convicted of treason for giving food to 4 men who came to her farmhouse and asked for food, and then implied in their conversation that they were British soldiers who had escaped from a prisoner of war camp in the Lancaster area and were trying to, make their way to the coast to get back to England. And
1782?
1782, yes, Suzanne.
1781?
Well,
Yorktown.
the treaties weren't done, and there was no fighting in this area anymore. And as long as you bring it up, Dick, I'll tell you basically the end of this story. Her neighbors petitioned for an appeal, and her appeal was heard, by the way, in the Supreme Executive Council, which was the equivalent of the state Supreme Court, which was held on the 2nd floor of what we know as Independence Hall. But it was, of course, the state government building at the time. And they didn't acquit her. They left the conviction stand, but she was fined 150 pounds. They reduced it to 50 pounds. And a collection was taken up and her fine was paid. And as far as we know, in any research that anybody has done on this, she died without ever learning that the 4 men that came to her house and indicated that they might be British prisoners of war were in fact from the Continental Army, and they were set out in the community to test the loyalties of the local residents. She was a victim of an intentional entrapment. Now, as long as I've digressed on that, I will also tell you that one of the ways that I learn about stories, and Deborah can attest to this too, but particularly when I do my local history stories, I'll go around to a group and, after I've done, I open up for questions, and people will say, well, my ancestor did this. And when I did a storytelling thing years ago, somebody mentioned Susanna Longenecker. And at the time, all I had was her name. Now, I'm bringing this up because this has been an important part of my approach to local history and storytelling. In the more than 30 years that I have researched local history, I have yet to find a story that was passed down through family lore to be false. But sometimes it takes quite a bit of digging. And on Susanna Longenecker's, the most information that I was able to find was in the state archives. It has a complete description of her appeal of her conviction. So, I'll stand on that. Now, getting into the 19th century, I've got some Underground Railroad stories. I've got some stories about the Civil War. I've got a few others. Some of the people might be considered famous, but I didn't really go for the big story with them. For example, there's lots and lots of stories you could do about Anthony Wayne, and he's a local Chester County boy. I did the burial of Anthony Wayne. Anthony Wayne died in Erie, or what's now Erie, Presque Isle on Long Lake Erie, and he was buried out there. And many, many years later, his son drove the 400 miles in a small wagon to bring his bones home. And I'll let you read the story. But basically, technically, Anthony Wayne is actually buried in 2 locations. Parts of Anthony Wayne are buried in 2 locations. And there are tons of ghost stories related to Anthony Wayne and Waynesboro, his home. And if you're interested in them, another local author, Sam Adams, am I saying that right? All of a sudden it sounds wrong, has wrote a collection of ghost stories of Chester County and the lower Brandywine. And he's got some of the Wayne ghost stories, so I didn't need to do them. I just told you about the burial. Well, we've also got some other things, like not too far from here, from Coatesville. In 1877, we had a tremendous tornado. And it was called the Great Tornado. And in my research, I not only found a write-up that was very, very thorough about the tornado itself, but I also found a little news clipping about a young woman who had gotten married the year before named Sally Widows. And she had a dream a couple of days before the tornado. And in her dream, she saw hundreds of, in her dream, it was colored people walking along the street near where they lived in their rental house. And her husband was a barn builder, and he was working on a barn down in Unionville, so during the week he stayed there. He only came home on weekends, but he was home when the tornado happened. It was a Sunday afternoon. And a house near there, and it was a black family that lived in a house near theirs. The house was lifted up and turned upside down. And at the time it had the mother and 3 children in the house, and the mother was killed. So we've got the story, that kind of story. On sadder notes, one of the big stories in my 20th century section, of course, is the lynching of Zachariah Walker. And that's one of the sadder parts of Coatesville's history. But it was interesting. You can't blame everything on Coatesville, because when the men that were charged with the lynching, they were on trial in Westchester at Chester County Courthouse, and because it was a Coatesville thing, no jury member on any of the trials for the lynching of Zachariah Walker came from Coatesville. They were all immediately dismissed if they had been called. So it was Chester County people, and they could not get a single conviction. Some of them, the trial lasted less than a half a day, and the jury came back with not guilties. So that's kind of a sad part of Coatesville's history. But I also included a story about a Tuskegee Airman. There were several in Chester County, and I was able to find 5, but the one that I could find the most information about was Andrew Smith, who was born and raised in Coatesville. And in fact, his son still, I think he might be a vice principal at one of the middle school. Carl? At the high school? That is Andrew's son. So that's kind of a good part, because he overcame a tremendous amount of prejudice at that time in order to train to become a Tuskegee Airman. And he came home and ran an auto body shop for many, many years, but kept his hobby as a pilot and flew whenever he could. And in 1996, I think it was, I'd have to look in my book, he was put into the Coatesville Hall of Fame. Mary Sullivan could probably tell you more about that. I'm not that much of an expert on Coatesville. So at any rate, that gives you a sample of the kinds of stories that I have. I guess there's one other that's got some connections to Coatesville. Buffalo Bill. Buffalo Bill Cody. Now, he's got some heavy-duty connections to Westchester, but in later life, there were 3 farms in the Coatesville area that boarded his animals. And And in fact, my friend Jenny that went out and took the photos, a friend of hers named Jack Stapleton also went with her, and it turns out that he's related to the Hayeses, and Carrie Hayes, after being married and having children the first time, ended up marrying Charlie Trego, who had worked for Buffalo Bill Cody out west, managing his farm and training his horses for 13 years. And then he married Carrie, and she didn't like living out west, so they came back here, and one of his farms was where they boarded the animals. And in fact, in the book, the photo that we used, and talk about vintage photo, it's not a really good image. I expected the history press to say, this is no good, we can't use it. You know there were horses here. You can well imagine that there might be buffalo. But did you know that in the last years of Bill Cody's Wild West show, he had other exotic animals like camels and elephants? And the photo that we have is of the Trego farmhouse with people sitting in front of it on top of a couple of camels. And during that time, and I'm sure you've got ancestors who remember this, they came in by train to Coatesville Station, and people gathered around. They knew when the train was arriving, and they waited to see these animals unload. And then whenever they were getting shipped to a show or back out west, they all gathered around to see them load the animals back on. And there were a few small shows. But Sunday afternoon in this area, people ended up taking a ride out to one of these farms so that they could watch the animals and see the men in training them and taking care of them. And, you know, that was a Sunday afternoon entertainment during the time that Buffalo Bill's animals were here in Chester County. So that gives you a little sample of the kinds of stories and why I like the story parts. I think it brings our history to life. And so I was fortunate enough to be invited to pursue this, and it was a real quick project that involved a lot of work, but it's also given me a tremendous amount of pleasure. So there you are. Thank you. Now, I always open up to questions, comments. Dick, you don't have anything to say. I could see you nodding your head at one point.
Have you met the guy that plays Ned?
Yes.
Yeah.
Actually, Noah Lewis.
No.
Noah Lewis, you probably met him too at the Marshallton Walk last year.
No,
He does Ned Hector, and he provided me with most of the information that I have on the story of Ned Hector. In fact, that's one photo that we did what they called a reenactor, and the history press really didn't want that kind of thing in, but because there's no image of him, and there's no way to really get any image of him, I was able to use the photo of Noah portraying Ned Hector.
Yeah. He does a good job on it.
He does a wonderful job.
Yeah.
He does a wonderful job, and in the schools, the kids are fascinated with his very detailed account of how they fire the cannons. And Ned actually wasn't just a teamster, he was an artillerist. He was assigned to the artillery division, and he was part of, it's in the book, but there's like 7 people that have to be around to work a cannon.
Right.
Because it's all done like this. And he was one of them. He was a bombardier. So, yes, I do. I wouldn't have been able to get enough information to make a complete story of Ned Hector without his help. And Ned Hector is one that after the war, he settled in the Norristown, Conshohocken area, and there is a street, Hector Street, that was named for him. Also, a sad footnote is that he applied many times for a pension. He was like 90 years old when he died, and he was turned down. Eventually, Pennsylvania granted him a one-time $30 award, which is not much considering the man spent 4 years
Right.
in the Army during the American Revolution. And there were some that did like 30-day stints that got that $30. But yeah, that's a sad comment on the way our country treats people sometimes. Anyway.
He worked at the History Day camp at Hibernian one year with me, and it was fun. The kids really
Yeah.
liked it.
They very much like
Yeah.
what he has to do. And he actually developed the character accidentally. He was asked to come into his son's class and talk about something. I guess he is a reenactor.
Oh.
And at that time, he felt that it was important that, if at all possible, we give the black perspective on those things. So he said the first time he did it, he had very little information at all. And now, I guess it's like me and Rebecca. It's become an obsession for him.
Yeah.
So, any other questions?
You mentioned the lynching of Taylor. I have a connection
Second.
to my mother with that very time. She was about 12 years old and lived on the farm on which the lynching,
Where it happened.
the burning occurred. And she saw the howling mob and everything else that meant that night. She was about 12 years old. And I think every time she was hospitalized with anesthesia, she relived that screaming mob.
Wow.
It had a terrible effect on her life.
Well, that was a tough time. I'm looking to see if what I did was I put in my notebook a few of the stories in bigger print so I could find things quickly. Zachariah Walker, it's estimated that there was as many as 5,000 people. And initially, when he was first captured, they had people leaving church services with their children and going to watch the events. It's a truly, truly sad statement on mob mentality. Very much so. And things like the district attorney, Gothrop, who was a very, very big name, because he was the district attorney and attempted to prosecute some of the people, he was voted out of office the following year and never reelected. And they did things like when they brought people in for arraignment, the people in Coatesville had protests. And when the men were freed, they had celebratory parades in Coatesville. It's a very sad time here.
All the regional newspaper articles are over in Carosino on the third floor.
Oh, now that I didn't know, or I would have been over there looking at it, see?
I don't know, maybe I'm the only one that is up there.
That could be. Well, there is quite a thorough collection of newspaper articles at the Chester County Historical Society that I read through, and there was also a book that was put out maybe as much as 10 years ago, using his quote that he asked, "Don't give me no crooked death, because I'm not white," and the book was titled "No Crooked Death," and it was written by a couple of professors, I think from Franklin and Marshall, or maybe Millersville, Lancaster. But it quite thorough. Now, oddly enough, my photographer's friend, Jack, was also related to the security policeman that Walker killed. So when he got involved in, just as a friend, going out to take photos, he didn't realize that that there were going to be stories here that tied directly in to him and his family. But his name, the policeman's name was Edgar Rice. Yes?
My memory indicates that this mob charged into the old Coatesville Hospital
Yes.
and got Walker chained to his bed. They couldn't get him loose. They took the bed and the man and carried it up to
The chief of police, Umstead, had been there to interrogate him and then left with one deputy guarding him. And when the mob came, the deputy made no attempt to defend him, because what was he going to do? There was a whole mob, and yes, he was burned in the field, and it was the bottom post of the bed was still attached to his leg by handcuff. He was still chained to the bedpost. They just ripped the bed apart. One of those metal hospital beds.
I believe the site of that crime was just further up the hill from Coatesville, past the Mennonite church, which is there right now.
Yes.
And maybe on the other side of the road.
You're absolutely right. I don't like to end on I wasn't even sure I was going to share that part of the story with you, because I don't like to end with that one. I find things like the Tuskegee Airmen just a little bit more uplifting, because this guy did what he needed to do and fought really hard, and I must not have copied that one. Andrew Smith, Tuskegee is in Alabama. Those men, when they were training, went through tremendous treatment from the people in Alabama that wanted no parts of them. And then when they finished all of their training, they were still trying to use them as escort service. And they finally were able to actually participate in the war, and they excelled. The Tuskegee pilots excelled. And there were more than 900 Tuskegee pilots trained. And when you add in the support teams, the mechanics, the navigators, it was close to 10,000. 10,000. And in order to go through that training, they had to go from, now, you might have thought Coatesville was prejudicial at the time. They didn't have any idea what they were going to face when they went to Alabama. And they overcame a tremendous amount in that, and then were finally recognized. And, finally, years after World War II, the schools were desegregated, and they finally kind of got the achievement. So Coatesville in the 20th century, from the beginning of the 20th century to the end, when Andrew Smith was put in the Coatesville's Hall of Fame, big changes in a century of time. And I really would prefer to close with that kind of thing. But there you are. So, any other questions? Thank you all for coming. I guess I should do a commercial now. Somebody asked me before this. I do have some books that I'm willing to sell. And if you had already gotten a book, I'll be happy to sign it for you. Okay?
Well, thank
There
you,
you go,
Susanna.
Scott.
Yeah, thank you very much. I have the books for sale. I know that the Dowling Forge one's a good one as well. And Chester County's full of interesting characters and a rich history. So again, we thank Susanna for taking the time to research that and sharing that with us tonight. So Thank you very much, Suzanne.
Thank you.
Thank you all for coming again. I want to thank ArcelorMittal and C3 TV and the Houston Foundation for helping the lecture series move forward. And of course, your interest as well helps us move forward. Next lecture is in first Thursday in November, and Gene DiOrio will be reviewing the year in review in his presentation style. So I'm looking forward to that. And then as well, he has another travel, or what's the, I have had the fall travel lecture, so we have the fall. The next one is in November, and then the holiday house tour. But thank you again for coming. There's things to drink on. And of course, Susanna, any questions in your book for sale. So thanks again for coming.
Thank you.